In a quiet, picturesque town nestled in the heart of the United States, life moved at a slow and peaceful pace. The town was surrounded by lush green forests, rolling hills, and a sense of community that made everyone feel at home. It was here that Jake Thompson, a hard-working construction worker in his late 20s, lived a simple yet fulfilling life. Jake was known for his dedication to his work, his warm smile, and his unwavering love for his golden retriever, Max. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Jake's best friend, his confidant, and his constant companion. Jake had adopted Max as a puppy from a local shelter 5 years ago, and since then, the two had been inseparable. Max was more than just a pet. He was family. With his golden fur, expressive brown eyes, and a tail that never stopped wagging, Max had a way of brightening even the darkest days. Jake lived in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town. The house was modest, but filled with love and warmth. Every morning, Jake would wake up to the sound of Max's gentle whimpers and the soft thud of his tail hitting the floor. Max had a routine of his own. He would wait patiently by Jake's bedside until he woke up, and then they would start their day together. Their mornings were always the same. Jake would brew a pot of coffee, and Max would sit by his feet, eagerly waiting for his breakfast. After a quick meal, Jake would grab his work boots and tools, and Max would follow him to the door, his tail wagging with excitement. Jake worked as a construction worker, and his job often took him to different sites around the town. Max accompanied him everywhere, becoming a familiar sight at every construction site. The townspeople adored Max. He was friendly, well-behaved, and had a knack for making people smile. The kids in the neighborhood would often stop by Jake's house to play with Max, and the elderly residents would save scraps of food just to see his happy face. Max had a way of bringing people together, and Jake couldn't have been prouder of his furry friend. Jake's work was physically demanding, but he never complained. He took pride in his job and enjoyed the sense of accomplishment that came with building something from scratch. Whether it was repairing a broken fence, constructing a new shed, or helping with a community project, Jake put his heart and soul into every task. And through it all, Max was by his side, watching over him and offering silent support. One of Jake's favorite things about Max was his unwavering loyalty. No matter how tough the day was or how exhausted Jake felt, Max was always there to cheer him up. After a long day at work, Jake would sit on the porch with Max by his side, watching the sun set over the horizon. They would talk. Well, Jake would talk, and Max would listen, his head tilted to one side as if he understood every word. Those quiet moments were precious to Jake, and he cherished them deeply. But life wasn't always easy for Jake. He had faced his share of challenges over the years. Growing up, Jake had lost his parents in a car accident, and he had spent most of his teenage years in foster care. It was a difficult time, but Jake had learned to be resilient and independent. When he turned 18, he moved out on his own, determined to build a life for himself. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and eventually bought his small house. Adopting Max had been one of the best decisions he had ever made. Max had filled a void in Jake's life, giving him a sense of purpose and companionship that he had always longed for. Jake often joked that Max was his guardian angel in fur, and in many ways, it was true. Max had a sixth sense when it came to Jake's emotions. If Jake was feeling down, Max would nuzzle his hand or rest his head on Jake's lap. offering comfort without saying a word. If Jake was happy, Max would bounce around, his tail wagging furiously, as if celebrating the joy. Their bond was unbreakable, and Jake couldn't imagine his life without Max. One of the things Jake loved most about Max was his adventurous spirit. Max loved exploring the woods near their house, chasing squirrels and splashing in the creek. Jake often took Max on hikes during the weekends, and those trips were some of their happiest memories. Max would run ahead, his nose to the ground, sniffing out every trail, and Jake would follow, laughing at Max's antics. Those moments in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, were a reminder of how simple and beautiful life could be. As the years went by, Jake and Max's bond only grew stronger. They had been through so much together, good times and bad, sunny days and stormy nights. Max had been there for Jake during some of his darkest moments, offering unconditional love and support. And Jake had done the same for Max, ensuring that he was always safe, healthy, and happy. But little did Jake know that their bond would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined.
Jake lived in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town. The house was modest, but filled with love and warmth. Every morning, Jake would wake up to the sound of Max's gentle whimpers and the soft thud of his tail hitting the floor. Max had a routine of his own. He would wait patiently by Jake's bedside until he woke up, and then they would start their day together. Their mornings were always the same. Jake would brew a pot of coffee, and Max would sit by his feet, eagerly waiting for his breakfast. After a quick meal, Jake would grab his work boots and tools, and Max would follow him to the door, his tail wagging with excitement. Jake worked as a construction worker, and his job often took him to different sites around the town. Max accompanied him everywhere, becoming a familiar sight at every construction site. The townspeople adored Max. He was friendly, well-behaved, and had a knack for making people smile. The kids in the neighborhood would often stop by Jake's house to play with Max, and the elderly residents would save scraps of food just to see his happy face. Max had a way of bringing people together, and Jake couldn't have been prouder of his furry friend. Jake's work was physically demanding, but he never complained. He took pride in his job and enjoyed the sense of accomplishment that came with building something from scratch. Whether it was repairing a broken fence, constructing a new shed, or helping with a community project, Jake put his heart and soul into every task. And through it all, Max was by his side, watching over him and offering silent support. One of Jake's favorite things about Max was his unwavering loyalty. No matter how tough the day was or how exhausted Jake felt, Max was always there to cheer him up. After a long day at work, Jake would sit on the porch with Max by his side, watching the sun set over the horizon. They would talk. Well, Jake would talk, and Max would listen, his head tilted to one side, as if he understood every word. Those quiet moments were precious to Jake, and he cherished them deeply. But life wasn't always easy for Jake. He had faced his share of challenges over the years. Growing up, Jake had lost his parents in a car accident, and he had spent most of his teenage years in foster care. It was a difficult time, but Jake had learned to be resilient and independent. When he turned 18, he moved out on his own, determined to build a life for himself. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and eventually bought his small house. Adopting Max had been one of the best decisions he had ever made. Max had filled a void in Jake's life, giving him a sense of purpose and companionship that he had always longed for. Jake often joked that Max was his guardian angel in fur, and in many ways, it was true. Max had a sixth sense when it came to Jake's emotions. If Jake was feeling down, Max would nuzzle his hand or rest his head on Jake's lap, offering comfort without saying a word. If Jake was happy, Max would bounce around, his tail wagging furiously, as if celebrating the joy. Their bond was unbreakable, and Jake couldn't imagine his life without Max. One of the things Jake loved most about Max was his adventurous spirit. Max loved exploring the woods near their house, chasing squirrels, and splashing in the creek. Jake often took Max on hikes during the weekends, and those trips were some of their happiest memories. Max would run ahead, his nose to the ground, sniffing out every trail, and Jake would follow, laughing at Max's antics. Those moments in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, were a reminder of how simple and beautiful life could be. As the years went by, Jake and Max's bond only grew stronger. They had been through so much together, good times and bad, sunny days and stormy nights. Max had been there for Jake during some of his darkest moments, offering unconditional love and support. And Jake had done the same for Max, ensuring that he was always safe, healthy, and happy. But little did Jake know that their bond would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Jake was about to face a challenge that would change everything. It all started on an ordinary day, just like any other, when Jake and Max headed to a construction site near the forest. It was a day that would prove just how deep their connection truly was. A day that would remind Jake that Max wasn't just a dog, he was a hero.
Life in the small town was predictable, but for Jake and Max, it was perfect. Their days followed a rhythm that was comforting in its familiarity. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains of Jake's small house, Max would stir from his spot at the foot of Jake's bed. He would stretch, yawn, and then nudge Jake awake with his cold, wet nose. Jake would groan, pretending to be annoyed, but he could never stay mad at Max for long. The sight of Max's wagging tail and eager eyes was enough to make him smile, even before his first cup of coffee. Their mornings were a well-rehearsed routine. Jake would shuffle to the kitchen, still half asleep, and start brewing a pot of coffee. The rich aroma would fill the small house, mingling with the scent of fresh pine from the woods outside. Max would sit patiently by his food bowl, his eyes fixed on Jake as if willing him to move faster. Jake would chuckle and pour a scoop of kibble into the bowl, watching as Max devoured it with the enthusiasm of a dog who hadn't eaten in days. After breakfast, Jake would get ready for work. He'd pull on his worn-out jeans, a flannel shirt, and his sturdy work boots. Max would watch him intently, his tail thumping against the floor in anticipation. Jake would grab his tool belt, his lunchbox, and his thermos of coffee, and then they'd head out the door together. The cool morning air would greet them, carrying the scent of dew and earth. Jake would take a deep breath, savoring the quiet stillness of the early hours before climbing into his pickup truck. Max would hop into the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window as they drove to the construction site. The construction site was a hive of activity even at that early hour. The sound of hammers, drills, and machinery filled the air, mingling with the chatter of workers. Jake would park his truck and grab his tools, and Max would follow him, tail wagging as he greeted the other workers. Everyone knew Max, and he was a favorite among the crew. The foreman, a gruff but kind man named Bill, would often joke that Max was the hardest worker on the site. "He doesn't even need a paycheck," Bill would say, ruffling Max's fur. Jake's job was physically demanding, but he loved it. There was something satisfying about building something with his own hands, about seeing a project come together piece by piece. Whether it was framing a house, laying bricks, or repairing a roof, Jake took pride in his work. And through it all, Max was by his side, watching over him with a quiet intensity. Max had a way of sensing when Jake needed a break. He would nudge Jake's hand or bark softly, as if reminding him to take a moment to rest. Jake would sit down on a stack of lumber, take a sip of water, and scratch Max behind the ears. Those small moments of connection were what kept Jake going, even on the toughest days. At lunchtime, Jake would find a quiet spot to sit and eat his sandwich. Max would lie down beside him, his head resting on Jake's knee. Jake would share bits of his lunch with Max, who would accept them with the grace of a king receiving a tribute. They would sit in companionable silence, watching the clouds drift across the sky and listening to the distant hum of machinery. It was during these moments that Jake felt most at peace, most content with his life. He didn't need much, just his work, his dog, and the open sky above him. After lunch, they would get back to work. Jake would focus on his tasks, and Max would patrol the site, keeping an eye on things. He had a knack for sensing when something was off. Once, he had barked furiously at a loose beam, alerting Jake just in time to prevent an accident. Another time, he had found a lost tool buried in the dirt, saving Jake hours of searching. The other workers often joked that Max was the site's unofficial safety inspector. "If Max barks, you better listen," they would say. As the day wore on, the sun would climb higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the site. Jake would wipe the sweat from his brow and push through the fatigue, knowing that the end of the day was near. Max would stay close, his presence a constant source of comfort and motivation. When the whistle finally blew, signaling the end of the workday, Jake would pack up his tools and head back to the truck. Max would trot beside him, his tail wagging in anticipation of the ride home. The drive home was one of Jake's favorite parts of the day. He would roll down the windows, letting the cool evening air rush in, and Max would stick his head out, his ears flapping in the wind. They would pass by fields of wildflowers, grazing cows, and the occasional deer darting across the road. Jake would hum along to the radio, and Max would bark in approval as if joining in the song. It was a simple joy, but one that Jake cherished deeply. When they got home, Jake would kick off his boots and collapse onto the couch. Max would jump up beside him, curling into a ball and resting his head on Jake's lap. They would sit like that for a while, just enjoying each other's company. Sometimes, Jake would turn on the TV, but more often than not, he would just sit in silence, stroking Max's fur and reflecting on the day. It was during these quiet moments that Jake felt most grateful for his life. He didn't have much, but he had Max, and that was enough. In the evenings, Jake would cook dinner, usually something simple like pasta or grilled chicken. Max would sit in the kitchen, watching Jake with rapt attention, hoping for a scrap or two. Jake would pretend not to notice, but he always ended up sharing a bite or two. After dinner, they would go for a walk around the neighborhood. The streets were quiet at that hour, with only the occasional sound of a car passing by or a dog barking in the distance. Jake would wave to his neighbors, and Max would sniff every bush and tree, marking his territory with the seriousness of a king surveying his kingdom. When they got back home, Jake would sit on the porch, sipping a cup of tea and watching the stars come out. Max would lie at his feet, his head resting on Jake's boots. They would sit there for hours, talking, or rather, Jake would talk, and Max would listen. Jake would tell Max about his dreams, his fears, and his hopes for the future. He would talk about the house he wanted to build someday, the places he wanted to visit, and the life he wanted to create. Max would listen intently, his eyes never leaving Jake's face, as if he understood every word. Eventually, Jake would yawn and stretch, signaling that it was time for bed. Max would follow him inside, curling up at the foot of the bed as Jake turned off the lights. In the darkness, Jake would whisper, "Good night, buddy," and Max would let out a soft sigh as if to say, "Good night, Jake." and then they would drift off to sleep, ready to do it all over again the next day. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air felt fresh and invigorating, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Jake and Max arrived at the construction site early, as they always did. The site was located on the edge of a dense forest, where the trees stood tall and proud, their leaves painted in shades of gold and red. It was a beautiful spot, but it came with its own set of challenges. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots, and the proximity to the forest meant there were always unexpected surprises, like the occasional deer or raccoon wandering onto the site. Jake was working on building a small cabin for a client who wanted a quiet retreat in the woods. It was a project he was particularly excited about. He loved the idea of creating a space where someone could escape the noise of the world and connect with nature. Max, as usual, was by his side, exploring the area and keeping a watchful eye on things. The other workers had grown accustomed to Max's presence and often joked that he was the site's mascot. The morning passed uneventfully. Jake S. focused on framing the cabin, carefully measuring and cutting pieces of wood. Max alternated between napping in a sunny spot and patrolling the perimeter of the site. Around noon, Jake decided to take a quick break. He sat down on a stack of lumber, pulled out his water bottle, and took a long drink. Max trotted over and plopped down beside him, resting his head on Jake's knee. Jake smiled and scratched Max behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "You're the best co-worker I've ever had." After the break, Jake got back to work. He was in the zone, completely focused on the task at hand. He didn't notice the loose nail lying on the ground until it was too late. As he stepped forward to grab a piece of wood, his boot came down hard on the nail. The sharp pain shot through his foot, and he let out a startled cry. He stumbled backward, clutching his foot, and landed hard on the ground. Blood seeped through his boot, staining the leather a dark red. Max was at his side in an instant, barking frantically. Jake tried to stand, but the pain was too intense. He gritted his teeth and looked around, hoping someone would hear Max's barks and come to help. But the site was deserted. The other workers had gone to a different part of the property to unload supplies. Jake was alone, except for Max. "It's okay, buddy," Jake said through gritted teeth, trying to reassure Max. But Max wasn't convinced. He nudged Jake's hand with his nose, his eyes filled with concern. Jake knew he had to get help, but he wasn't sure how. His truck was parked a good distance away, and he wasn't sure he could make it there on his own. He tried to stand again, but the pain was unbearable. He collapsed back onto the ground, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Max barked again, louder this time, and then did something Jake had never seen him do before. He grabbed Jake's sleeve in his teeth and started tugging, as if trying to pull him to his feet. Jake stared at Max in surprise. "What are you doing, boy?" he asked, his voice trembling. Max let go of his sleeve and nudged his hand again, this time more insistently. It was as if he was saying, "Trust me, I'll help you." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Max, let's do this." He grabbed onto Max's collar and used it to pull himself up. The pain in his foot was excruciating, but he pushed through it, determined to make it to the truck. Max walked slowly and steadily, matching Jake's pace. Every step was agony, but Jake focused on Max's reassuring presence and the thought of getting to safety. The journey to the truck felt like it took forever. Jake's vision blurred with pain, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. But Max never wavered. He stayed by Jake's side, his body pressed against Jake's leg for support. When they finally reached the truck, Jake leaned against it, breathing heavily. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and managed to unlock the door. He climbed into the driver's seat, wincing as he moved his injured foot. Max jumped into the passenger seat, his eyes never leaving Jake. Jake started the engine and drove toward the nearest hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. The drive was a blur of pain and adrenaline. Jake kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on Max's head, drawing comfort from his presence. Max sat quietly, his ears twitching at every sound, as if he knew how much Jake needed him. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Jake parked haphazardly and opened the door. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the pavement. Max was out of the truck in an instant, barking loudly to get someone's attention. A nurse, rushing into the hospital, heard the commotion and ran over. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. "I stepped on a nail," Jake said, his voice weak. "I need help." The nurse called for assistance. The pain in Jake's foot was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was sharp and unrelenting, radiating up his leg with every heartbeat. He sat on the ground, clutching his injured foot, trying to steady his breathing. The construction site was eerily quiet, save for the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. He knew he couldn't stay there. He needed medical attention, and fast. But the other workers were nowhere to be seen, and his truck was parked what felt like a mile away. Max stood beside him, his body tense and alert. His usual playful demeanor was gone, replaced by an intensity that Jake had rarely seen. Max's ears were perked up, and his eyes darted around as if assessing the situation. He let out a low whine and nudged Jake's arm with his nose, his warm breath brushing against Jake's skin. "I'm okay, buddy," Jake said through gritted teeth, though he knew he wasn't fooling anyone, least of all Max. He tried to stand, putting weight on his good foot, but the moment he shifted, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled and fell back to the ground, his vision blurring at the edges. "This is bad," he muttered, more to himself than to Max. "Really bad." Max barked sharply, as if scolding Jake for giving up. He circled Jake once, then stopped in front of him and stared into his eyes. There was something in Max's gaze, a determination, a sense of purpose that made Jake pause. Max had always been smart, but this was different. It was as if Max knew exactly what needed to be done. "What are you thinking, boy?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. Max responded by grabbing Jake's sleeve in his teeth and tugging gently. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "You want me to get up?" Max let go of the sleeve and barked again, this time more insistently. He stepped closer to Jake, pressing his body against Jake's side as if offering himself as a support. Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Max, let's do this." He wrapped one arm around Max's sturdy shoulders and used his other hand to push himself up. The pain in his foot was excruciating, but he pushed through it, focusing on Max's steady presence. Max stood perfectly still, his muscles tense as he bore some of Jake's weight. Slowly, carefully, Jake managed to get to his feet. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Max wagged his tail briefly, as if acknowledging the praise, but his focus remained on the task at hand. Jake took a tentative step forward, leaning heavily on Max. It was slow going, and every movement sent jolts of pain through his foot. But Max was patient and unwavering. He matched Jake's pace, stopping whenever Jake needed to catch his breath. The journey to the truck felt like an eternity. The uneven ground made it even more difficult, and Jake had to navigate around rocks, roots, and piles of construction materials. At one point, his injured foot caught on a loose stone, and he stumbled, nearly falling. Max quickly adjusted his position, bracing himself to keep Jake upright. "Thanks, buddy," Jake said, his voice strained. Max responded with a soft whine, as if to say, "I've got you." As they inched closer to the truck, Jake's strength began to wane. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his breathing was labored. The pain in his foot was overwhelming, and he felt lightheaded. He leaned more heavily on Max, who didn't falter. Max's determination was unwavering, his focus entirely on getting Jake to safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the truck. Jake leaned against it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Max sat down beside him, his tail thumping against the ground. Jake reached out and ruffled Max's fur, his hand trembling. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. Max tilted his head, his tongue lolling out in what almost looked like a smile. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice. Max watched him intently, his ears twitching at every sound. When Jake finally managed to unlock the door, he climbed into the driver's seat, wincing as he moved his injured foot. Max jumped into the passenger seat, his eyes never leaving Jake. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Jake's mind was foggy with pain, but he focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Max sat beside him, his body tense and alert. Every so often, he would nudge Jake's arm with his nose, as if checking to make sure he was okay. Jake reached out and placed a hand on Max's head, drawing comfort from his presence. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Jake parked haphazardly and opened the door. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the pavement. Max was out of the truck in an instant, barking loudly to get someone's attention. A nurse rushing into the hospital heard the commotion and ran over. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. "I stepped on a nail," Jake said, his voice weak. "I need help." The nurse called for assistance, and within moments, a wheelchair was brought out. Jake was helped into it, and as he was wheeled into the hospital, he turned to Max. "Stay here, boy," he said, his voice firm despite his pain. Max sat down obediently, his eyes following Jake until he was out of sight. Inside the hospital, the doctors cleaned and bandaged Jake's foot, giving him a tetanus shot and a prescription for painkillers. They told him he was lucky. The nail had gone deep, but it hadn't hit any major nerves or blood vessels. Jake knew he wasn't lucky. He had Max to thank for getting him there in time. When Jake was finally discharged, he found Max waiting patiently in the hospital lobby. The receptionist smiled and said, "Your dog hasn't moved an inch. He's been waiting for you the whole time." Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. He knelt down, as much as his injured foot would allow, and wrapped his arms around Max. "You're my hero, buddy," he whispered. Max wagged his tail and licked Jake's face as if to say, "I've got your back." The drive home was quiet, but the bond between Jake and Max felt stronger than ever. Jake knew that without Max, things could have ended very differently. That night, as they sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, Jake made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would always take care of Max, just as Max had always taken care of him. The hospital was a whirlwind of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet, serene woods Jake had been in just hours earlier. The bright fluorescent lights, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and the constant hum of voices and machines were overwhelming. Jake sat in a wheelchair, his injured foot propped up, as a nurse wheeled him through the bustling corridors. Max had stayed behind in the lobby, but Jake could still feel his presence, as if Max's unwavering loyalty had left an invisible tether between them. The nurse brought Jake to a small examination room and helped him onto the bed. "The doctor will be with you shortly," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. Jake nodded, though his mind was still reeling from the events of the day. He leaned back against the pillow, trying to steady his breathing. The pain in his foot had dulled slightly, thanks to the painkillers the nurse had given him, but it was still a constant throbbing reminder of the accident. As he waited, Jake's thoughts drifted to Max. He couldn't stop thinking about how Max had stepped up when he needed him most. It wasn't just the physical support. Max had been a source of emotional strength, too. Jake had always known Max was special, but today had proven just how extraordinary he was. "That dog deserves a medal," Jake muttered to himself, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The door opened, and a doctor walked in, holding a clipboard. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Hi, I'm Dr. Patel," she said, introducing herself. "Let's take a look at that foot." She pulled up a stool and carefully removed the makeshift bandage Jake had wrapped around his foot. Her expression remained neutral as she examined the wound, but Jake could tell she was assessing the severity of the injury. "You're lucky, Doctor," Patel said after a moment. "The nail went deep, but it missed any major nerves or blood vessels. Still, we'll need to clean the wound thoroughly to prevent infection." She glanced up at Jake. "How did this happen?" Jake explained the accident, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I wasn't paying attention," he admitted. "Stepped right on a loose nail at the construction site." Dr. Patel nodded. "Accidents happen. What's important is that you got here quickly." She paused, then added, "I heard your dog helped you." "That's incredible." Jake's face lit up at the mention of Max. "Yeah, he's something else. I don't know what I'd do without him." Dr. Patel smiled. "Dogs have a way of knowing when we need them most." She stood up and began gathering supplies to clean the wound. "This might sting a bit," she warned as she poured antiseptic onto a clean cloth. Jake braced himself as doctor. Patel began cleaning the wound. The antiseptic burned, and he clenched his fists, trying to distract himself from the pain. He thought about Max again, focusing on the memory of Max's determined eyes and steady presence. It helped somehow to know that Max was waiting for him, just as he always did. Once the wound was clean, Dr. Patel applied a fresh bandage and gave Jake a tetanus shot. "You'll need to keep the wound clean and dry," she instructed. "Change the bandage daily and watch for any signs of infection, redness, swelling, or pus, If you notice anything unusual, come back right away." Jake nodded, absorbing the information. "How long until I can walk on it?" he asked. "Give it a few days," Dr. Patel advised. "You'll need to stay off your feet as much as possible. I'll prescribe some painkillers to help with the discomfort, but rest is crucial." She handed him a prescription and a set of crutches. "These should help you get around." Jake took the crutches, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. He hated the idea of being sidelined even for a few days, but he knew Dr. Patel was right. He needed to take care of himself if he wanted to heal properly. As he was wheeled out of the examination room, Jake's thoughts turned to Max again. He couldn't wait to see him, to thank him for everything he had done. The nurse brought him to the lobby, where Max was sitting patiently by the reception desk. The moment Max saw Jake, his tail started wagging furiously, and he let out a happy bark. "Hey, buddy," Jake said, his voice filled with affection. He leaned down as much as he could with the crutches and ruffled Max's fur. "You're the best, you know that?" Max responded by licking Jake's hand, his eyes shining with what looked like pure joy. The receptionist smiled at the interaction. "He's been waiting for you the whole time," she said. "Didn't move an inch." Jake's heart swelled with pride. "That's my boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to the receptionist. "Thank you for keeping an eye on him." "It was my pleasure," she replied. "He's a special dog." Jake nodded, unable to find the words to express just how special Max was. With the help of the crutches, he made his way to the truck, Max trotting beside him. The drive home was quiet, but the bond between Jake and Max felt stronger than ever. Jake kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on Max's head, drawing comfort from his presence. When they got home, Jake settled onto the couch, his injured foot propped up on a pillow. Max jumped up beside him, curling into a ball and resting his head on Jake's lap. Jake reached for the remote and turned on the TV, but he wasn't really paying attention to the screen. His mind was still replaying the events of the day, and he couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to disaster. "You saved me today, Max," Jake said softly, stroking Max's fur. "I don't know how to thank you." Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with what Jake could only describe as love. He let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes as if to say, "You don't need to thank me. I'll always be here for you." That night, as Jake lay in bed, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would always take care of Max, just as Max had always taken care of him. He drifted off to sleep with Max at his feet, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and peace. The weeks following the accident were a period of adjustment for Jake and Max. Jake's foot healed slowly but steadily, thanks to Dr. Patel's care and Max's constant vigilance. Max seemed to understand that Jake needed rest, and he stayed close to him, always ready to offer comfort or fetch something Jake needed. Jake, in turn, spent more time at home, catching up on paperwork and planning his next steps. He knew he couldn't keep working at the same pace, especially with his foot still tender, and he began to think about making a change. One evening, as Jake and Max sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an old friend, Mike, who had moved to the city a few years ago. Mike had heard about Jake's accident and wanted to check in. The two got to talking, and before Jake knew it, Mike was offering him a job opportunity in the city. "There's a big construction project coming up," Mike said over the phone. "They're looking for experienced guys like you. The pay's good, and there's room for growth. What do you think?" Jake hesitated. He had always loved the quiet simplicity of small-town life, but the idea of a fresh start was tempting. The accident had shaken him, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was a sign that he needed to make a change. He looked down at Max, who was lying at his feet, chewing on a stick. "What do you think, buddy?" Jake asked. "Shall we give the city a try?" Max looked up at him, his tail thumping against the porch floor. It was as if he understood every word. Jake smiled and scratched Max behind the ears. "Okay then, let's do it." The decision made, Jake began preparing for the move. It wasn't easy. He had lived in the small town his whole life, and leaving felt like saying goodbye to a part of himself. But he knew it was the right choice, not just for his career, but for Max too. The city offered more opportunities, and Jake wanted to give Max the best life possible. Packing up the house was an emotional process. Jake went through old photos, letters, and mementos, each one a reminder of the life he was leaving behind. Max seemed to sense Jake's mood and stayed close, offering quiet companionship. When the day finally came to leave, Jake stood in the empty house, his heart heavy with nostalgia. He knelt down and hugged Max tightly. "We're in this together, buddy," he said. "No matter where we go, we'll always have each other." The drive to the city was long but uneventful. Jake's truck was packed to the brim with their belongings, and Max sat in the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window as the scenery changed from rolling hills to bustling highways. Jake had never been a fan of city life, but as they approached the skyline, he felt a flicker of excitement. This was a new chapter, a chance to start over. Mike had helped Jake find a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit with a tiny balcony. But it was cozy and affordable. Jake and Max spent their first day unpacking and settling in. Max explored every corner of the apartment, sniffing and inspecting as if to make sure it was safe. Jake watched him with a smile, grateful for Max's adaptability. The next morning, Jake started his new job. The construction site was massive, with cranes, bulldozers, and workers everywhere. It was a far cry from the small projects Jake was used to, but he quickly found his footing. The work was challenging but rewarding, and Jake enjoyed being part of something big. Max, however, had to stay home during the day. Jake hated leaving him alone, but he knew it was necessary. He made sure to leave Max with plenty of toys, food, and water, and he promised to come home as soon as he could. Life in the city was different, to say the least. The noise, the crowds, and the constant hustle and bustle took some getting used to. Jake missed the quiet of the small town, but he appreciated the opportunities the city offered. He made new friends at work, and he even joined a local gym to stay active. Max, too, seemed to adjust well. He loved their evening walks around the neighborhood where he could sniff new scents and meet other dogs. But despite the positives, there were challenges. Jake often worked long hours, and he worried about Max being alone for so long. He tried to make up for it by spending quality time with Max on the weekends, taking him to parks and exploring the city together. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was neglecting Max, and it weighed on him. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Jake came home to find Max waiting by the door, his tail wagging furiously. Jake knelt down and hugged him, feeling a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said. "I know it's been tough, but I promise things will get better." Max licked Jake's face as if to say, "It's okay. I understand." That night, as Jake lay in bed, he made a decision. He would find a way to balance work and his responsibilities to Max. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to make it work. After all, Max had always been there for him, and Jake owed it to him to do the same. Life in the city was a whirlwind of activity, and Jake quickly found himself caught up in its fast-paced rhythm. His new job was demanding, with long hours and tight deadlines. The construction project he was working on was one of the largest in the city, and the pressure to deliver quality work on time was immense. Jake thrived on the challenge, pouring his heart and soul into every task, but it came at a cost. His days started early, often before the sun had fully risen. Jake would wake up to the sound of his alarm, groggy and disoriented, and stumble into the kitchen to make coffee. Max would be right behind him, his tail wagging as he waited for his breakfast. Jake would pour a scoop of kibble into Max's bowl and give him a quick pat on the head before rushing to get ready for work. "I'll be back soon, buddy," he would say, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. The commute to the construction site was another hurdle. The city's traffic was relentless, and Jake often found himself stuck in gridlock, inching forward at a snail's pace. He used the time to mentally prepare for the day ahead, but his thoughts often drifted to Max. He hated leaving him alone in the apartment, even though he knew Max was capable of handling it. Still, the guilt lingered, a constant ache in the back of his mind. Once at the site, Jake's day was a blur of activity. He worked alongside a team of skilled laborers, each of them focused on their respective tasks. The site was a maze of scaffolding, machinery, and materials, and Jake had to stay alert to avoid accidents. He took pride in his work, meticulously measuring, cutting, and assembling, but the physical toll was undeniable. By the end of the day, his muscles ached and his hands were calloused and sore. The long hours meant that Jake often didn't get home until well after dark. He would unlock the door to find Max waiting for him, his tail wagging so hard it seemed like it might fly off. Jake would drop his bag and kneel down to hug Max, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. "I'm sorry, buddy," he would say, scratching Max behind the ears. "I know it's been a long day." Max never held it against him. He would follow Jake to the kitchen, where Jake would heat up a quick dinner, usually something from the freezer, and they would eat together. Jake would sit on a couch, his plate balanced on his lap, and Max would lie at his feet, content just to be near him. Those quiet moments were precious, a brief respite from the chaos of the day. But as the weeks went by, Jake began to notice changes in Max. The once energetic dog seemed quieter, more subdued. He spent more time sleeping and less time playing with his toys. Jake tried to make up for it by taking Max on long walks on the weekends, but it wasn't enough. He could see the longing in Max's eyes, the unspoken plea for more time together. One evening, after another grueling day at work, Jake came home to find Max lying by the door, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. Jake knelt down and stroked Max's fur, his heart heavy with guilt. "I'm sorry, Max," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I haven't been there for you like I should." Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with understanding. He licked Jake's hand as if to say, "It's okay. I know you're doing your best."
But Jake knew it wasn't okay. He had always promised himself that he would take care of Max, no matter what. And now, he felt like he was failing him. That night, as he lay in bed, Jake made a decision. He would find a way to balance work and his responsibilities to Max. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to make it work. The next day, Jake approached his foreman, a gruff but kind man named Carl. "I need to talk to you about my schedule," Jake said, his voice steady despite the nerves churning in his stomach. Carl raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, Jake?" Jake took a deep breath. "I've been working long hours, and it's taking a toll on my dog. He's alone all day, and I can see it's affecting him. I need to find a way to spend more time with him." Carl nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. Dogs are family. Let's see what we can do." Over the next few days, Carl worked with Jake to adjust his schedule. They shifted his hours so that he could leave earlier in the afternoon, giving him more time at home with Max. It wasn't a perfect solution. Jake still had to work hard to meet deadlines, but it was a step in the right direction. Jake also started looking for ways to make Max's days more fulfilling. He bought new toys and puzzles to keep Max entertained, and he even set up a camera so he could check in on him during the day. But the biggest change came when Jake discovered a doggy daycare nearby. It was a bit of a splurge, but Jake knew it was worth it. Max would have the chance to socialize with other dogs and get the exercise he needed. The first time Jake dropped Max off at daycare, he felt a pang of anxiety. What if Max didn't like it? What if he felt abandoned? But when he picked Max up that evening, his worries melted away. Max bounded out to greet him, his tail wagging furiously and his eyes shining with excitement. The staff told Jake that Max had been a hit, playing with the other dogs and charming everyone with his friendly demeanor. From that day on, Max's days were filled with activity and companionship. Jake still worked hard, but he no longer felt the crushing guilt of leaving Max alone. And when he came home in the evenings, he could see the difference in Max. The spark was back in his eyes, and his energy was infectious. Their evenings together became a cherished routine. Jake would cook dinner, something more substantial than frozen meals, and they would eat together. Afterward, they would go for a walk around the neighborhood, exploring new streets and meeting new people. Jake even started taking Max to a nearby dog park on the weekends, where they would spend hours playing fetch and relaxing in the sun. As the weeks turned into months, Jake and Max settled into their new life in the city. It wasn't always easy, but they had found a balance that worked for them. Jake's career was thriving, and Max was happier than ever. Their bond, forged through years of loyalty and love, had only grown stronger. From that day on, Max's days were filled with activity and companionship. Jake still worked hard, but he no longer felt the crushing guilt of leaving Max alone. And when he came home in the evenings, he could see the difference in Max. The spark was back in his eyes, and his energy was infectious. Their evenings together became a cherished routine. Jake would cook dinner, something more substantial than frozen meals, and they would eat together. Afterward, they would go for a walk around the neighborhood, exploring new streets and meeting new people. Jake even started taking Max to a nearby dog park on the weekends, where they would spend hours playing fetch and relaxing in the sun. As the weeks turned into months, Jake and Max settled into their new life in the city. It wasn't always easy, but they had found a balance that worked for them. Jake's career was thriving, and Max was happier than ever. Their bond, forged through years of loyalty and love, had only grown stronger. It was a cold winter evening, and the city was blanketed in a thin layer of snow. Jake had just finished another long day at the construction site. His muscles ached, and his hands were numb from the cold, but he was eager to get home to Max. He had promised himself that tonight, no matter how tired he was, he would spend quality time with his furry companion. Jake climbed into his truck, the engine sputtering to life after a few tries. The heater took its time warming up, and Jake shivered as he pulled out of the parking lot. The streets were quieter than usual, the snow muffling the usual sounds of the city. Jake drove carefully, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the slippery roads. About halfway home, Jake noticed something was wrong. The truck began to sputter, and the engine made a strange knocking sound. He frowned, glancing at the dashboard. The fuel gauge showed plenty of gas, but the temperature gauge was creeping into the red. "Come on, Not now, Jake muttered, tapping the gauge as if that would fix the problem. A few minutes later, the truck gave one final shudder and came to a stop. Jake tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. He was stranded in the middle of a deserted stretch of road, with no streetlights and no other cars in sight. Jake groaned and leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. Just great, he said to himself. What else could go wrong? He pulled out his phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. His battery was dead. Jake cursed under his breath. He had been so busy at work that he had forgotten to charge his phone. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was picking up. He knew he couldn't stay in the truck for long. The temperature was dropping fast, and the heater wasn't working. Jake grabbed his coat and stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at his face. He popped the hood and peered inside. Though he knew next to nothing about engines, the problem wasn't obvious, and even if it had been, Jake didn't have the tools or the knowledge to fix it. He slammed the hood shut and leaned against the truck, his breath visible in the freezing air. What am I going to do? He muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He thought about walking to the nearest gas station, but he had no idea how far away it was. The snow was coming down harder now, and the wind was howling. He couldn't risk getting lost or slipping on the icy roads. Just as Jake was about to give up and resign himself to spending the night in the truck, he heard a familiar sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder and more distinct. It was the sound of barking. Jake's heart leaped. "Max," he called, his voice filled with hope. A moment later, Max came bounding out of the darkness, his golden fur dusted with snow. He ran straight to Jake, his tail wagging furiously, and jumped up to lick Jake's face. Jake knelt down and hugged Max tightly, his eyes stinging with tears. "How did you find me, buddy?" he asked. His voice choked with emotion. Max barked and tugged at Jake's sleeve, as if urging him to follow. Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Max, lead the way." Max turned and began trotting down the road, his nose to the ground as he followed some invisible trail. Jake followed, his boots crunching in the snow. The wind was bitter, and the snow stung his face, but he focused on Max's steady presence. Max seemed to know exactly where he was going, his confidence unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, Jake saw the glow of lights in the distance. It was a gas station, its neon sign flickering in the storm. Jake's heart swelled with relief. "Good boy, Max," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You did it." They reached the gas station, and Jake hurried inside, Max close behind. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a kind face, looked up in surprise. "You okay, son?" he asked. Jake nodded, still catching his breath. "My truck broke down a few miles back. My dog led me here." The attendant's eyes widened. "That's one smart dog you've got there." He handed Jake a cup of hot coffee and let him use the phone to call for a tow truck. As Jake waited, he sat on the floor with Max, stroking his fur and thanking him over and over. "You're my hero, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Max wagged his tail and licked Jake's face, as if to say, "I'll always be here for you." When the tow truck arrived, Jake and Max climbed into the cab, grateful for the warmth. The driver took them back to Jake's truck, and after a quick assessment, he confirmed that the engine had overheated and would need repairs. Jake sighed, knowing it would be an expensive fix, but he was just relieved to be safe. As they drove home, Jake kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on Max's head. He couldn't stop thinking about how Max had found him in the middle of a snowstorm, how he had led him to safety without hesitation. It was a reminder of just how special Max was, and how much he meant to Jake. That night, as they sat on the couch, Jake made a silent promise to himself. No matter how busy life got, he would always make time for Max. He would never take their bond for granted. Max had saved him in more ways than one, and Jake knew he would spend the rest of his life repaying that loyalty. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the city covered in a pristine white blanket. Jake and Max were back to their usual routine, but the memory of that cold, harrowing night lingered in Jake's mind. He couldn't stop thinking about how Max had found him in the middle of nowhere, leading him to safety with unwavering determination. It was a reminder of just how extraordinary Max was, and Jake made a silent vow to never take their bond for granted. Life in the city continued to be busy, but Jake had learned to prioritize his time with Max. He adjusted his work schedule, leaving earlier in the afternoons so he could spend more time with his furry companion. Max, in turn, seemed happier and more energetic, his tail wagging furiously whenever Jake walked through the door. Their evenings were filled with long walks, playful games of fetch, and quiet moments on the couch, where Jake would scratch Max's ears and tell him about his day. But despite their newfound balance, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had noticed subtle changes in Max's behavior. Little things, like how Max sometimes hesitated before jumping onto the couch, or how he seemed to tire more quickly during their walks. Jake tried to convince himself that it was just a sign of Max getting older, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. One evening, as they were walking through the park, Max suddenly stopped and sat down, panting heavily. Jake knelt beside him, his heart racing with worry. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, stroking Max's fur. Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with trust, but he didn't get up. Jake's stomach churned with anxiety. He knew he had to get Max to a vet, but it was late, and most clinics were closed. Jake carried Max back to the truck, his mind racing. He drove to the nearest emergency animal hospital, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Max lay in the passenger seat, his breathing labored. Jake kept one hand on Max's head, murmuring words of. As Max's heart condition became a part of their daily lives, Jake and Max grew even closer. Jake adjusted his routine to prioritize Max's care, preparing nutritious homemade meals and taking him on shorter, more frequent walks. He also negotiated a flexible work schedule, allowing him to spend more time at home with Max. Their evenings were filled with quiet moments, reading aloud, listening to music, or simply sitting together on the porch. Weekends were reserved for adventures, like exploring a nearby park or visiting a dog-friendly cafe. Through it all, Jake cherished the small, everyday moments that made their bond so special. One evening, as they watched the sunset, Jake thanked Max for teaching him about loyalty and love, vowing to face every challenge together.